All right, guys, round two for this analysis of the hacks tragedy and the bans against hacks. I'm going to try to make this a much shorter video than my previous one, which was over an hour. So that was pretty long. I don't expect many people to watch all that. So I try to take the most important points and condense them into this presentation. Now, I should give some brief background info on me. Now, I'm by no means an expert in some of the stuff I'm talking about. However, I do have more knowledge than the average person when it comes to psychological matters. I do have a master's degree in psychology, and I almost have a PhD in psychology. Just have a year left in my program, and I've studied things like abnormal psychology, mental health. They haven't been like the main focuses of my research, but I'm familiar with many concepts and just theories in psychology, and I've tried to connect that to this as best I can. So again, that's some brief background on me. Not a complete expert, but also not just some random guy off the street talking about the stuff either, for whatever it's worth. Okay, with that, let's get into it. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's just trying to recognize cognitive distortions. It's a useful term that comes up just in the cognitive behavioral therapy literature and just common symptoms of various mental health disorders. So I think this is very key just to recognize when other people are using these distortions, these biases, which people are often unaware of, that they're using them or not. And I believe this is linked with neuroticism. There's definitely a lot of research that suggests that. Hence why these cognitive distortions are symptoms in especially mood disorders like depression and anxiety, also personality disorders. And the general public definitely uh, definitely displays these biases as well. We all do. So it's not to say that if you ever mind read or engage in binary thinking, that's bad and you shouldn't ever do it. It only gets problematic when one, you use these biases quite frequently. If you use a lot of them together, so they kind of compound each other when they're used together. So something like should statements on its own, not necessarily terrible. Of course, it really depends on the kinds of should statements or the moral judgments you make, of course. Even mind reading, not necessarily bad. It doesn't always mean it's paired with the hostile attribution bias, where you assume hostile intent. But if you combine mind reading with catastrophizing and discounting positives, then you're probably going to mind read in this negative way where you infer malicious intent, and then that can justify malicious or harmful behavior in response because you're just detecting more enemies and more threats. So that's a theme that I've been um, homing in on recently. It's just this threat detection. And it's no wonder that some people are very vigilant of threats. It's no wonder, of course, right? It keeps you safe, and maybe based on past experiences, it makes sense to be on the lookout for threats. But this can certainly backfire when you exaggerate how threatening something is, or you perceive a threat when there is no threat, and when you're activating your stress response often. Technically, there's two stress responses, a fast and slow one, but if you're constantly monitoring for threats and perceiving threats, that is certainly a factor that can predict some kind of, you can say, aggression or just some kind of harmful behavior to mitigate those threats, especially if they're, perceived in other people, and if others are viewed as simply good or bad, which that's something Jonathan Haidt talks about in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, one of the great untruths, this lack of nuance where we divide people into either just good people or bad people. And these biases really reduce nuance. So whenever you see some kind of very simple take that lacks nuance, it's likely that these biases, of course, there's other cognitive biases, but it's likely that these biases may play a role, especially when the simplified take has this negative spin with some kind of threat detection. So neuroticism can be linked to this heuristic or the strategy of better safe than sorry, which again means just perceiving many threats. Like a smoke detector, it's going to have a lot of false positives, which is kind of by design so that it's very likely to pick up on the actual threats. For it to pick up on like the actual smoke, the actual threats, it's going to have to also pick up on some fake threats or some false positives. And there's arguments for why we need heuristics to organize our perception, because there's just too much information to process and calculate. Anyways, I know I didn't go through these point by point. I'm doing that on purpose because I know you guys can always just read it on your own or pause and read it. So, yes, a key takeaway from this whole presentation is to be on the lookout for cognitive distortions and this better safe than sorry heuristic when people are perceiving things, making interpretations, coming up with conclusions, and those things tend to work together. And cognitive distortions and this better safe than sorry strategy can guide the way people try to reduce harms. Because reducing harms is a great thing. I understand consequentialism. I think it's a great goal. But the way that can get implemented and the way people do that cost-benefit analysis can be distorted by these cognitive distortions and this better safe than sorry heuristic. Okay, I've probably talked too much on this slide, but this will be shorter than my other video. That's the main thing. Okay, so what I want to highlight here, I'm assuming you guys are pretty familiar with what happened with hacks and the bans. So his first video was not great, and pretty sure most people, if not everyone, can agree on that. However, that doesn't mean that the video was all bad with no positives in it, right? We can argue if it was like mostly negative or mostly positive. The main thing is, yeah, the video overall obviously could have been done better, and I think it's reasonable that Hacks did or was told to take down the video and whatnot. Whether some kind of temporary ban is warranted for that video, that's a whole other thing. I'm not super convinced either way, but even if a temporary ban is warranted for this first video, I can't see it being a long ban that's warranted, especially for someone like Hacks, that's for sure. We'll come back to this minimum necessary force heuristic, which is a very useful way to ensure that you are reducing harms, overall harms, as best as possible. So again, we can all agree the video wasn't great. However, people are going to have different reactions to the video. Some people are going to perceive it as this completely heinous, awful, super harmful thing that warrants a very harsh punishment. And that's the thing with this threat detection and these cognitive distortions and neuroticism. you can amplify the harm that you see. And the more harm that you see, that warrants a much tougher ban or sentence or punishment to mitigate that terrible, terrible harm. So I think that's pretty intuitive, let's say. And it's unfortunate because I can certainly see how Hax's language and comparisons in this first video are going to just evoke quite a bit of emotion, right? He's talking about Hitler and totalitarianism. Like, I remember the first time I watched this video, I had this emotional response too. I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy. And then you have to try to look past that that emotional response and say, okay, like there's still some good stuff here. There's still some decent points being made, even if, yes, some of the comparisons and speculations are a bit off base and a bit wild, right? And of course, it wasn't the most ethical thing for Hacks to do, because then people are going to associate Leffen in this in a negative light that's more warranted, that will cause some harassment, which is another thing I didn't really get on this slide, but I'll mention here briefly. Are people responsible for how their followers react to them? My short answer is it really depends. And having some nuance here, I really think is important, right? Like if someone, of course, explicitly tells their followers to do something bad, clearly they're responsible if their followers do something bad. Then there's a spectrum here. If someone makes these awful comparisons and demonizes someone, and then their followers do something bad to that person, okay, you can argue there's like partial responsibility. It really like depends on how that's done and how gratuitous or unhinged it was. Of course, people are also like fairly autonomous beings and most responsible for their own actions. Okay. So in this video, you can argue like, okay, like you can certainly argue that Hacks had some partial responsibility for harassment that was directed towards Leffen. He did not have to use these Hitler and totalitarianism comparisons, sure. In his ban appeal video, very, very different. Very different. And if you lump those in the same category, I think that is clearly a sign of just lacking nuance, maybe having some other motivations there, which I'll talk about a bit on the next slide. Okay, so again, greater neuroticism and using these cognitive distortions, especially combining them, means that you're going to overestimate the harm that you perceive in Hax's original video, so that's going to warrant a very harsh ban, like this indefinite ban or something like that. And then this influences how people try to reduce harms. And again, it's an important goal to try to reduce harms. But if you see someone as this bully, this perpetrator, this bad person, you're going to be less motivated to reduce the harms done to them when you're punishing them to reduce harms done to the victim. And that's why the minimum necessary force heuristic is helpful, because again, if you really are a consequentialist and you want to reduce long-term collective unnecessary suffering as much as possible, that has to apply to everyone. And again, by minimum necessary force, that just means the minimum punishment that inflicts the smallest cost or damage to the person you're punishing, to ensure deterrence, to ensure that they don't make that same harmful thing again. And honestly, I think Hacks was going to talk about Leffen again, like if he didn't get a ban, but not in this way. I think he clearly learned, like, okay, the totalitarianism stuff was just like overblown and unfounded and a bit unhinged. And yeah, so but again, to some people, just hacks talking about Leffen in general is the offense, and that is very harmful and warrants extreme punishment. And that, I think, is just far too restrictive and censorious. And again, we're lacking nuance there. There's a difference in saying, hey, Leffen did some bad stuff. There's a big difference between saying that and saying Leffen is practicing totalitarianism on the Smash community. Very, very different things. Okay. So in the indefinite ban clearly is not using minimum necessary force, so we're already not reducing harms as best as we can. And a good way to ensure that you're reducing harms well is to follow moral principles like fairness. And even one of the TOs in the I think this was for the permanent ban, mentioned like, yeah, it seems a little unfair to hold hacks responsible for some of what his crazy followers did on the fringes. But that just reduces harms best. That's what one of the TOs reasoned. The thing is, when you're doing things that seem unfair and that are unfair, that's often going to have unintended consequences long term and just backfire and not be the best way of reducing harms. And now I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but that's fine. Again, all the points are on the slide if you want to read them. So I don't just want to read things out. Lots of people thought, oh, why couldn't hacks just accept the ban and just move on? It's much harder to accept a ban or a punishment if it's unfair. And this is why, to reduce harms collectively long term as best as we can, any kind of punishment that's being sentenced or deployed really should be fair, because then it's much easier for people to accept that punishment. And because if we do conclude that the permanent ban was unfair, like it was not the minimum necessary force, clearly, and just some kind of 50+ year ban sentence was just wildly overblown, how can we expect someone to accept such a gratuitous, unreasonable, unjust punishment, especially when it just deprives them of their life's main meaning, like source of meaning and purpose and joy? When if it was fairly taken away, that's different. It's still going to hurt to accept that, but it's easier to accept that than if it was unfairly taken away. Okay, last slide here. So then Hacks made the ban appeal video. He not only served the recommended 2-year length, which came with the indefinite ban, he almost served an additional year on top of that. Didn't hear back from these TOs, so he's stuck in limbo in the state of uncertainty. Think he feels that he's viewed as the antagonist and has to correct that public perception of him. And if he doesn't do that, this indefinite ban is just going to continue indefinitely. So clearly terrible lack of communication here on this unnecessary uncertainty Hacks feels. He makes this video. This video is drastically different than the first one, even though he might talk about Leffen briefly or reference the initial video. And then you have, I think this was the New York statement where they said it's clear that he is unable to let go of his original motivation behind the videos. And that's them lumping those two videos together. The evidence.zip2 video and the ban appeal video, right? That it came from the same motivation, which is insane to me. The ban appeal video, it's coming from the motivation of him wanting to overturn the ban. It's a very different motivation. Then the previous video, the evidence.zip2 video, where he had some beef with Leffen, and, I don't know if you want to say that he was trying to smear him, but clearly it was a very different motivation. They were very different videos. Okay. So it's just, it's pretty incredible just how they ignored the external factors, the situational factors that contributed to Hacks making the ban appeal video, which seems like a classic case of the fundamental attribution error, where um, someone does, especially if someone does something bad, you just point to, oh, they did that because of their internal characteristics. They have these, nefarious motivations and intentions. It's just due to the person. Whereas um, external factors that may have explained or help explain why the person did the thing, those factors are ignored and downplayed. So a very famous cognitive error. And I feel like it could be related to uh, just the better safe than sorry strategy from neuroticism. That's more of a hypothesis, though. Either way, it's a case of just a cognitive bias that lacks nuance, which again is a theme here, just the lack of nuance that's being shown by these cognitive biases or distortions. So again, a main theme, we have the cognitive distortions with this better safe than sorry strategy from neuroticism that amplifies the amount of harm that's perceived, which therefore warrants a very harsh punishment. And then something that I just find interesting, I think this comes from some kind of dichotomous thinking where people, when you're categorizing different kinds of bans, it's like, okay, on a broad level, there's temporary bans and then there's permanent bans. So it's like, oh, and if you just stick on that broad level, oh, we did a temporary ban, it didn't work. Now we got to increase the punishment, so it's got to be a permanent ban. And to me, that's just such an insane way of conceptualizing this, which again comes from lack of nuance, this simplified thinking with these very broad binary categories. Because again, that indefinite ban had a 2-year recommended sentence, okay? So if you wanted to increase the punishment slightly, but again, there's a question of should we even increase the punishment? That's a whole other thing. But if you were to increase it, it can be a ban for 3 years, right? That's an increase from the 2-year recommended length. But a permanent ban to someone like Hacks would be something like 50 years. So he made a comment like that it's going to affect like the rest of his life, and someone like him certainly seemed like that would be the case. Regardless, though, it would be something like decades for Hacks. And it's like, oh, that's the next step up from that 2-year recommended indefinite ban. Like, okay, sure. So use of minimum necessary force to reduce all kinds of harms as effectively as possible. Clearly, that was not shown here. Okay, so last thing I want to highlight is this argument. People, whether they were making this argument genuinely or not, I think with lots of people, they genuinely believe this, that unbanning Hacks wouldn't have helped him, it would have made things worse, or that it would be very minimal help, like just the whole Band-Aid thing. So, I mean, clearly, we know what the outcome was, so there's that. But I think people are motivated to believe this because of prior assumptions that they had. And I'm not going to get too much into like predictive processing and this hierarchy of beliefs and predictions that people hold. But essentially, if you hold these prior assumptions, there's this like anchoring bias. and you want to interpret things in ways that are aligned with your prior assumptions. And you're going to be motivated to come to conclusions and interpretations that align with your prior existing assumptions. So because people already thought that Hex did this terrible thing and he broke the rules that he agreed to, made this other terrible video, the ban appeal thing, deserves this punishment, and that he did get the ban, and the ban gets normalized. So then that's a way of you accepting that, okay, like this is the way things are. Instead of questioning all that, it's much easier to interpret new things in a way that's consistent with that, and to form beliefs that is in ways that are consistent with that, right? So instead of questioning all of that, it's much easier to feel motivated to reason that, oh, you know what, this is actually for the best. Unbanning Hex would make things worse. He really needs therapy, not this sense of belonging and meaning that has been the main source of meaning in his life, uh, and the one thing that he continually asks for. And of course, if you're motivated to like hold him accountable for the terrible things he's done and to punish him, then you're less motivated to reduce harms done to him as effectively as possible. So, and then in case I didn't make something too clear, that clause or that rule that Hex agreed to, which by the way, couldn't really properly consent with the power imbalance, but the whole rule that you can't even talk about the video or Leffen, and which he did in the ban appeal. So it's, oh, therefore he broke the rules, so we got to punish him. But that rule was made not out of fairness, but based on that harm reduction motivation. One of the TOs did pretty much explicitly say that, mention that it's probably not fair, but if your actions consistently cause consistent harms and consequences, you have to correct for that. And again, the ban appeal video is very different from the evidence.zip 2 video. So, and then of course, that rule becomes even more unfair given the state of limbo and uncertainty that Hex was put in. So it's like he doesn't know what's happening. So he's being, you can say, implicitly incentivized to say something to try to rectify the situation. You know, I'm not saying it was strategically a good decision. Clearly, it wasn't the strategically good decision, but he was in this cloud of uncertainty, felt like there was no way out. So those external factors did motivate him to make this ban appeal video, to change the public perception of him, which may have lifted the ban, because it seemed like the ban was not being lifted from his perspective due to just this terrible lack of communication. So then punishing him for talking about the video, that's where that rule of you can't talk about the video becomes even more unfair when you consider those external factors and the state of uncertainty that Hex was put in, which he never should have been put in. Okay, I said I was going to make this 10 minutes. Clearly that was not the case, but this is much shorter than my original video, which was the plan. So if anyone found this useful, that's great. I just felt motivated to try to use whatever psychological knowledge and just analytical tools and whatnot to try to make sense of this. I've been thinking about this for quite some time now. It's just such a terrible thing that was easily preventable. So yeah, I just felt compelled to say something, and hope whoever watches this can take something away from it. Okay, cheers, guys.